Hey there. Tonight, we step onto a prairie so wide and so cold that a house can look like a prayer made of timber, mud, and stubbornness. The darker truth in this story is simple. A frontier family could arrive with wagons full of hope, a piano, a plow, a quilt, a Bible, and all the confidence in the world. Then discover in a single blizzard that none of those things meant much unless they could raise 4 walls before the wind changed its mind. If this kind of quiet history is your sort of shelter, leave a like. Subscribe if you want to stay a while. And come with me. The sky is already lowering. The snow smell is already in the air. And somewhere out there, long before the stove is hot and the door can shut cleanly, a family is learning how thin the line is between home and weather. The prairie at dusk does something strange to the human mind. It makes you feel both very large and very small at once. Large because there is so much room around you that your thoughts seem to spread for miles. Small because none of that room belongs to you. If you were standing here with me, boots sinking lightly into stiff grass, rimmed with frost, you would notice how the last strips of pink are slipping away beneath a bank of gray cloud. The horizon is so flat and so endless that it almost seems to tilt. And the cold has a smell. Not a romantic pine forest sort of smell. Something drier, sharper, a metallic hint in the wind, as though the air itself were warning you, gently but firmly, that winter on the plains is no gentleman. A few months ago, the same ground sang with grass. Now wagon wheels grind through ruts that are beginning to harden. Oxen huff steam into the twilight. Leather harnesses creak. A tarp snaps hard enough to sound like a gunshot in the rising wind. A child, bundled in too many layers and still not enough, clutches a rag doll whose dress is already stiff with old dust and fresh cold. A woman lifts down an iron pot. A man stands beside the wagon tongue, looking over land he has not yet learned to fear properly. Honestly, I have always found that moment heartbreaking. Not because these people are foolish exactly, though some were, but because they are standing in the most dangerous phase of hope, the phase before reality has had time to correct it. The West drew families with promises. Land, ownership, fresh beginning, a chance to step out from under someone else's shadow and make a life on soil that looked, at least in summer brochures and bright official language, almost generous. Some came from eastern states, where winters were harsh but familiar. Some came from Europe, carrying old habits, old skills, old ideas about what a farmhouse should be and how long the cold could reasonably be expected to last. The prairie, as it turned out, had not read any of those assumptions. By October, and sometimes earlier, the wind began to harden. The loose boards of unfinished shelters rattled. Trees, where there were trees, stripped themselves bare with alarming speed. The temperature could plunge so low that even seasoned settlers found themselves shocked by the violence of it. That shock sits at the center of this whole story. Many frontier families simply did not understand what a prairie blizzard could do. Snow in memory often behaves politely. It falls. It settles. It drifts against fences and makes the world quieter. A plains blizzard could begin as something deceptively ordinary, A dusting, a harmless seeming flurry, then turn within hours into a white wall that erased distance, direction, and judgment all at once. Men who had farmed for years could get lost walking from house to barn. Children could vanish within yards of a doorway. Temperatures dropped far below zero. Wind found every crack. Frost took fingers, ears, livestock, confidence. It is debated, even now, whether the earliest waves of settlers were truly reckless or merely too inexperienced with this kind of land to imagine what was coming. Perhaps those are the same thing in different coats. And what they carried west tells its own quiet little story. There were axes, sows, iron kettles, sacks of flour, jars of lard, seed, blankets, rifles, nails counted like treasure, and sometimes things so tenderly impractical that they still make me smile. Pianos, for instance. Real pianos dragged across open country by families who, against all reason, believed that one day there would be a room fit for such a thing. I love that image. Somewhere on the edge of a blizzard, culture itself bouncing in a wagon bed, insisting on Beethoven while the wind plots murder outside. Human beings are absurd in the most moving way. Still, no amount of music could delay the real work. Shelter had to rise. Quickly. Not in the pleasant, measured pace of a house built in a settled town, but in the rhythm of panic disguised as determination. At sunrise, the men went for timber if there was timber to be had. Near river groves, they counted themselves lucky. Out on treeless stretches, every usable log became precious enough to alter the whole mood of a day. The sound of an axe biting into a trunk carried through the cold with a bright, ringing certainty. Chips flew white and pale against the frozen ground. Resin bled where bark split. Gloves stiffened. Fingers numbed. Shoulders burned. No one really had the luxury of complaining for very long, though I imagine quite a lot of complaining happened anyway, because frontier life may have built character, but it also built blisters. Women worked just as steadily. Brush for kindling. Fires coaxed from poor fuel. Pots kept going. Children managed. Clothes dried when they could. Rags saved for later stuffing into cracks. The practical mind on a frontier was never still. It moved constantly from one need to the next. Water, food, phlegm, bedding, baby, wood, roof, draft, door. A small child ran messages. Another gathered dropped splinters for the fire. Their cheeks burned red. Their noses ran. Their boots grew wet and then froze at the edges. No one was quite comfortable, and comfort was not really the point anymore. The point was to get something upright before the weather took the choice away. The first touch of a half-built log wall is not reassuring. You might expect it to feel substantial, but it often feels raw, sticky with sap, rough enough to catch the skin at the palm. A wall at that stage is mostly an idea with bark still on it. Men notched logs carefully, because they had to. Cabins were never just piled wood. Each corner had to lock against the next. The timbers fitted like a grim puzzle meant to resist the push of the wind. When several neighbors could be gathered, there might be a raising. More hands, more lifting, more grunting and cursing, and the kind of rough humor that appears when everyone is too tired to perform dignity. That sort of labor has a music to it. If you listen closely enough, the scrape of a dragged beam, the thud as a log drops into place, the short call for another heave, the clap of mittened hands to bring warmth back into numb fingers. Inside the future cabin, the floor at first was only packed earth, hard and cold underfoot. The openings for windows were little more than rough gaps. Glass was too precious for many families, too expensive, too easy to break on the journey west. The roof beams went up with a chorus of strain. Someone always seemed to be one slip away from disaster. The air smelled of fresh wood, sweat, smoke from a side fire, and the faint iron tang of blood when a knuckle met bark badly. A woman in the corner stirred beans and salted pork while keeping one eye on a sleeping baby wrapped tight in quilts. It is easy from a distance to make all this look heroic. Up close, it was mostly exhausting. Yet there was something ceremonial about it, too. Some families carved initials into hidden parts of the logs before stacking them. A heart, a date, a pair of names. I have always liked that detail. Not because it is efficient. It certainly is not. But because it reveals how badly people wanted these cabins to be more than mere boxes against death. They wanted permanence. Meaning, a sign that this was not just a pause in suffering, but the start of belonging. Whether the Prairie agreed with them was another question. As the walls climbed from waist-high to shoulder-high to something like full height, the mood changed. You can feel it if you stand in the center of the room in your imagination. The wind is still there, of course, slipping through everywhere, but it is no longer touching you from every side at once. Already the shape of shelter is teaching the body to unclench. A dog curls near the first hearthstones. Children play in the snow dragged over the threshold. Lantern light finds the grain of the new logs and makes the room look briefly almost finished. Almost. That is one of the great frontier words. Almost warm. Almost sealed. Almost enough. Because by the time night came, these cabins were rarely complete. 4 walls might stand, but the roof might still be canvas stretched over beams until proper covering could be managed. The seams between logs still shone with threads of outside light. There might be no proper door yet, only a heavy blanket or a hanging piece of hide to interrupt the draft. And still, compared with the wagon, it was luxury. Thin luxury, perhaps, but luxury all the same. The first fire transplanted indoors popped and sighed in a crude hearth of gathered stones. Smoke wandered where it pleased before deciding whether to rise. The room filled with the smell of pine, mud, breath, and hope. Outside, the prairie darkened into something enormous and unreadable. Somewhere, perhaps, wolves moved over the crusted snow, or perhaps the settlers only imagined them at every edge of the lantern glow. Fear has a way of adding pause to any shadow. Inside, though, the family leaned against rough walls that had not stood that morning and felt, if only for a little while, the strange relief of danger being on the other side of something. Not far away, never far away. But outside, a frontier cabin on its first night was not beautiful in the polished sense. It was crooked in places, drafty in many. The floor was hard. Snow hissed against canvas overhead. A seam in the wall might breathe cold air directly across your ankles. And yet a single lantern on a crude shelf could make the whole place feel like a declaration. We are here. We are still here. For one night at least. The blizzard has not had its way. The family exhales together. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way people do when exhaustion outruns fear for a little while. You lean your shoulder against the log wall and feel it creak. But hold. The dog steams faintly by the fire. A child falls asleep mid-sentence. Someone laughs too loudly at something only barely funny, which is often the sound of relief in hard places. And as the wind builds outside, testing the walls with long, cold hands, you begin to understand the real shape of frontier survival. It was never a single grand triumph. It was 1,000 rough decisions, each one half practical and half prayer. Tomorrow, the seams will have to be filled, the roof strengthened, the light blocked where it should not be, the warmth trapped where it can be. But tonight there is a cabin standing alone on the white prairie, its lamplight pulsing faintly through its cracks, like a heartbeat in the snow. And just beyond it, lower to the ground and stranger to the eye, another kind of shelter is beginning to rise out of the land itself. The timber cabin glows for a while in the mind. All resin, smoke, and rough courage. But frontier winter had a way of teaching settlers that one kind of shelter was never enough. Even a well-raised log house could fail them if the gaps between its walls were left too open, if timber proved too scarce, if snow came before the roof was ready, or if the land itself offered more dirt than wood. So the story sinks lower now, closer to the ground, into the shelter that looked less like a house and more like a piece of prairie deciding, reluctantly, to let humans hide inside it. Before that descent, though, there is the business of sealing the log cabin. A wall of stacked timber can feel solid until the first real wind arrives. Then every little seam becomes a voice. Air whistles. Snow sifts inward. Families learned quickly that a cabin without chinking was little better than a wooden sieve. So, one of the most ordinary, desperate, and strangely intimate frontier tasks began. Kneeling by the wall with cold mud in your hands, stuffing the world shut. If you were kneeling beside them now, the mixture would feel unpleasantly alive. Clay, strav, moss, old rags, whatever could be pressed into service. Wet earth under the nails. A smell like riverbank and thawing roots. Children handed up clumps of moss. A mother pushed strips of worn cloth into deeper gaps. A father smeared mud over it all, flattening it with the heel of his hand while his breath smoked in the dim cabin light. Some used newspapers. Some used hymn pages. Imagine that. Yesterday's sermon or a headline from far away pressed between two logs because paper, in the end, had to become insulation before it could remain literature. I have always found that detail beautifully sad. This patching went on constantly. Clay cracked when it froze and thawed. Moss rotted. Rags sagged. Mice found uses for all of it. Yet each freshly sealed seam changed the room. The hiss of the wind dulled. The draft around the ankles softened. The cabin exhaled. You could run your hand along the wall and feel only a faint tremor of cold where before there had been a steady stream of it. It was not elegance. It was persistence. The prairie taught people that survival often looks less like building a perfect thing and more like repairing an imperfect one every single morning. Still, not every family could count on timber. On the open plains of Nebraska, Kansas, and farther west, trees were sometimes so scarce that a log cabin was almost a fantasy. The prairie had grass, soil, sky, and wind in terrifying abundance. What it did not always have was wood. And so settlers turned to the land itself. They cut the skin of the prairie into blocks and stacked their homes out of earth. A sod house from a distance could look half buried even before the snow came. Low, brown, a little mournful perhaps, more like a patient animal lying still than a proper dwelling. But up close, there is a rough genius to it. Thick bricks of sod were cut with spades, dense loaves of earth and roots, then laid one atop another until walls rose chest high, then higher. The smell was not timber and sap now. It was damp loam, meadow torn open, raw soil breathing at your shoulder. By the 1870s, these sod houses had become common across the treeless plains. Quick to raise, heavy enough to resist wind, surprisingly warm when snow packed itself against their outer walls. If the log cabin had been dragged west as a cultural dream, the sod house felt more like an argument with the land that slowly turned into a compromise. The settlers did not shape wood into a home. They carved the prairie and let it harden around them. Touch one of those walls in your imagination and it crumbles slightly under the fingertips. Roots dangle. Fine dirt powders the skin. There is comfort in the thickness of it. Wind does not slip through earth the way it slips through careless boards. And yet the same qualities that made a sod house warm made it troublesome. Damp air clung to clothes. Water found its way down from melting snow. Insects nested in the walls. Snakes, in spring, sometimes warmed themselves near the hearth after emerging from the sod itself. There is a frontier image for you. You tuck yourself deeper into a quilt and discover your house has quietly produced a reptile. History can be very rude. Scholars still debate whether sod houses were ingenious adaptations or evidence of desperation. Honestly, they were clearly both. That is what makes them so human. A sod wall could hold heat like an earthen quilt. It could also leak, slump, soften, and drop crumbs of the prairie onto your supper. A roof laid with grasses or more sod insulated beautifully until it grew too heavy with moisture or snow. Then it sagged. Then it leaked. Then, in the worst cases, it failed with very little warning. Frontier comfort always seems to arrive with a handshake and a knife in the same hand. Step inside one now. The ceiling is low enough to make you aware of your own height. The floor is dirt, swept smooth, but never fully clean. Buckets wait beneath known leaks like old acquaintances. A stove glows in one corner, orange and faithful, and slightly smoky, because perfect draft was a luxury too. Quilts hang against the walls, not only for color, though they helped, but to cut some of the damp chill. Shelves made from scavenged boards hold jars of pickles, beans, maybe a precious little crock of butter, darkened with salt. The room smells of earth, smoke, vetvool, and supper. There is a softness to sound in a sod house. The storm outside becomes muffled, not gone, only pushed farther away. It can feel almost as though you are underground already, hidden from the white world and its long appetite. Families lay close together on straw mattresses, their breath mingling, their bodies warming the heavy air. Children stared up at a low ceiling and imagined, perhaps, that the whole prairie was lying on top of them. They would not have been entirely wrong. And then there were the dugouts, when time was too short or timber too rare even for a proper sod structure. Some families simply cut their homes into creek banks or hillsides. A hole enlarged into a room, a door fitted if possible, a roof propped with beams, salvaged from wagon parts or whatever wood could be had. In a hard land, a den could become a house very quickly, but a dugout offered one invaluable gift. The wind had less of you to strike. The first steps down into a dugout change the air. Outside, the cold may be slicing and bright. Inside, it becomes thick, damp, and enclosed. Your nose fills with the smell of clay. Moisture beads on the walls. Water drips in steady intervals into a pan or bucket. The earth holds you, but it also presses close. If the sod house is a compromise with the surface, the dugout feels like surrender to the hillside, though sometimes surrender is exactly what survival requires. I have always found dugouts the most haunting of these shelters, not because they are the worst, though they could be miserable, but because they blur the line between refuge and burial. A family slept half underground while the storm moved over them, hearing the wind only as a muted moan. Candles hissed in the damp. Smoke from the stovepipe sometimes lingered low because the draft was poor. Mice made themselves at home. Frogs or other small creatures appeared from the walls with the confidence of permanent residents welcoming an awkward new tenant. And yet people lived in them. Not briefly always, but for entire seasons. They hung quilts against the walls to soften the rawness. They set jars of dried apples on tiny shelves. They named the frogs, in at least one recorded case, because frontier humor had to turn even damp discomfort into company. A child could wake to the sound of water dripping and think, for a moment, that the house itself was ticking like a clock made of mud. Researchers argue over whether dugouts represented admirable adaptation or proof that families had pressed too far into a place not ready to hold them. Again, both seem true. They blocked the wind. They insulated naturally. They also flooded, molded, collapsed, and made ordinary breathing feel like work when the smoke settled low. Imagine lying under a heavy quilt, trying to sleep while a storm thunders above and dirt sprinkles onto your blanket from the trembling ceiling. It is hard to call that comfort, but harder still to deny it could mean the difference between life and death. There is another tenderness in these shelters that can be missed if we only look at them from a distance. Births happened there. Meals were stirred there. Songs were sung with the smell of damp earth in the room. Children played in the half-light. A dog slept by the entrance and twitched in dreams. Human beings have a strange gift for domesticating misery, just enough to keep going. The practical improvisations continued everywhere. When snow drifted high against a cabin or sod house, families sometimes welcomed it despite its menace. Packed snow could become insulation, sealing lower cracks and blocking the worst drafts. Imagine that contradiction. The very thing that might bury your doorway also warms your room. Settlers noticed such things quickly. The prairie was always teaching hard lessons, and one of them was that an enemy could become, under the right pressure, a kind of helper. Snow against the walls, mud in the seams, earth over the roof. None of it graceful, all of it useful. There were moments, too, that bordered on comedy. A traveler once nearly rode straight onto a sod roof without realizing a family was eating supper beneath it. Children dug little tunnels in drifted snow and played there until their parents shouted them out. A roof leaked so steadily into one pan that the plink of water became, by force of repetition, almost soothing. This is how people remain human, in conditions that would prefer to make them purely miserable. They adapt, but they also joke. They nickname the frogs. They complain about the snakes. If you stand outside one of these prairie shelters at dusk, the sight is oddly moving. A sod house crouches low under the weather. The dugout entrance darkens in a bank of earth. Smoke rises faintly into the cold. No visitor from the east would mistake it for the ideal home promised in land advertisements. But inside there is a lamp. Someone is stirring a pot. Someone is folding quilts. Someone is scraping mud from boots and trying not to think about how long winter still intends to stay. That, more than anything, is the mood of these shelters. Not triumph. Not neat pioneer romance. A low burning determination. The log cabins said, "We will build our way through this." The sod house answered, "Then we will stack the land itself around us." The dugout whispered, "And if that fails, we will go into the earth and let it keep the wind off our backs." By the time the family settles for the night in one of these earthen homes, the storm above has become a distant heavy music. Candles throw small yellow stains against brown walls. The stove radiates heat unevenly, one side of your body warming, while the other still remembers the cold. A child shifts under a patched quilt. A mother reaches up to catch a leak before it lands on the bedding. A father lies awake a little longer than he admits, listening for the groan that would mean the roof has taken too much snow. They are hidden, but not secure. Sheltered, but never finished with danger. And as you lie there with them in your imagination, half buried and half safe, you begin to understand the frontier in its truest winter form. It was never conquered cleanly. It was bargained with. One wall, one sod brick, one patch of mud, one dripping roof, one long night at a time. Outside, the white prairie stretches without mercy. Inside, under dirt and quilt and smoke and breath, life lowers itself close to the ground and waits for morning. A barn in winter does not smell like comfort at first. It smells like hay gone sweet and damp, manure warming under straw, leather tack, animal breath, and the faint sourness of wet wool brought in from a storm. But when the blizzard has sharpened itself into a living blade and the cabin walls are still half doubtful, that smell can become the smell of mercy. The frontier taught families strange arithmetic. A room built for cattle might save a child. A hen fluttering in the dark rafters might be irritating in summer and curiously reassuring in January. Many families preferred, of course, to stay inside whatever proper house they had managed to build. Preference, though, is a soft word, and Prairie winter had little patience for soft words. If a cabin leaked too badly, if the roof was still canvas, if the stove smoked instead of drawing cleanly, if a family had come too late in the year and was still living under little more than wagon cover and stubborn prayer, then the barn became more than a place for livestock. It became another kind of shelter, rude but warm, and sometimes warmer than anything made for human dignity. If you were standing beside me now, pushing through a warped barn door while snow drove sideways across the yard, you would feel the warmth before you fully understood it. Not stove warmth, not clean hearth warmth, animal warmth. A low living heat rising from bodies that chew and stamp and breathe without drama. It hits the face differently. Humide, heavy, a little rank. And yet, after a walk through a cutting wind, it could feel almost luxurious. Horses steam gently in their stalls. Cows shift their great weight and exhale clouds that catch the lantern light. Chickens murmur from a beam overhead, sounding half asleep and half offended by the weather. This was no fantasy of frontier simplicity. It was necessity in boots. There are letters and recollections suggesting that in severe storms, or while homes were unfinished, families really did bring bedding into barns and sleep alongside their animals. Some historians think it was less common than later stories imply, more emergency measure than regular habit. Others suspect it happened more often than people preferred to admit, because pride and livestock make awkward roommates on the page. Either way, the logic is easy to understand. A barn full of animals is a bank of stored heat. The sound inside such a place is its own little weather. Hooves shifting in the straw. A chain clinking softly against a post. The wet, patient chew of a cow working through hay as if nothing in the world were urgent. A horse blows sharply through its nostrils and lifts its head, then settles again. Somewhere, a pig snuffles in the bedding with a depth of contentment that would be comic if everyone nearby were not so tired. Human voices lower themselves instinctively in that air. A mother unwraps quilts. A father chooses a drier patch of straw. Children stop complaining for a moment simply because the warmth has found them and their bodies have no reason yet to mistrust it. Honestly, I have always found those scenes unexpectedly tender. The frontier likes to present itself, in the stories told later, as a place of stern self-reliance. But winter kept reminding people that survival could be embarrassingly communal. Humans, horses, dogs, tzos, chickens, all breathing into the same dark, sharing what warmth they had. A baby tucked closer to the flank of a patient cow. because that broad living side radiates more dependable heat than the far corner of a drafty cabin. A dog curled at a child's feet, fur smelling of snow and smoke. A mother holding a tin cup of warm milk so carefully that it seems almost sacred. There are details from settler memory that feel nearly absurd until you sit with them. Children naming the cows that kept them warm. Hens roosting above blankets. Someone milking in the dark because the act itself, routine and warm and practical, helped calm a room half shaken by the storm outside. One old anecdote tells of newborn twins kept alive through a bitter night by being bedded close to the heat of animals in the barn. Whether every retelling kept its facts straight is hard to know, but the emotional truth is clear enough. Warmth came where it could, and frontier life had no real use for squeamishness. Still, a barn was no paradise. Straw hides sharp stalks that find skin through a blanket. The floor, no matter how freshly bedded, holds the smell of droppings and old dampness. Dust rises when an animal shifts. Feathers drift. A lantern swings from a nail and throws long moving shadows that make every beam seem alive. If you try to sleep in such a place, you do not sleep deeply at first. You listen to the wind outside, yes, but more to the large breathing close by, to the slow rumble inside a cow, to the sudden kick of a horse startled by something no human has noticed. You know that feeling when your body is exhausted but your mind refuses to believe the room is safe enough to surrender inside it. It would have been like that. There were risks besides discomfort. Illness could move between people and animals when they were crowded too close. Bedding quickly grew fouled. A dropped lantern could make a tragedy of the whole arrangement in seconds. And yet the barn stayed in the frontier repertoire of survival because it answered one problem very efficiently. It kept the freezing wind from stripping warmth out of skin as fast as a tent or wagon cover would. On the prairie, that could be the difference between inconvenience and death. From there, the story lifts, in a sense, upward and outward into another frontier contradiction. Snow itself, enemy and ally in one white body. Families learned, as the winters taught them, that drifts piling against a cabin could bury them in one mood and insulate them in another. A wall of packed snow along the logs blocked drafts better than bad chinking. A half-buried house might be miserable to dig out and strangely warmer for the trouble. There is something darkly funny in that. The storm tries to swallow your shelter and accidentally improves it for the night. Step outside now in your mind. Morning after a heavy blow. The cabin stands, half hidden under a slope of white. Snow has risen nearly to the window opening. The door must be shoved hard because the drift has set against it like a second wall. Your gloved hand sinks into the bank and meets compacted cold, dense and almost architectural. Children, being children even on the edge of discomfort, sometimes carved small caves into such drifts. Parents yelled at them for it, quite reasonably. Yet I can imagine the temptation. Blue light in a hollow of snow. The world suddenly hushed. A secret room shaped by the same storm that had spent all night trying to kill your fire. Inside a snow-packed cabin, sound changes. The wind no longer shrieks directly through every seam. It muffles. It becomes a pressure more than a voice. The room may smell more strongly of smoke because air does not move as freely, and that had its own dangers. But the blessed absence of ankle-level drafts could make an entire family feel as if some invisible hand had at last agreed to help. Yet the same insulating drift could become a trap. If thaw came too quickly, water seeped. If the door froze shut behind packed snow, then protection and imprisonment began to look alarmingly alike. One diary account describes a family nearly trapped by a frozen door, the house so tightly banked by snow that getting out at dawn became an act of shoulder-driven excavation. Another memory tells of a woman appreciating the warmth of a cabin nearly buried to the roof, only to find water later dripping steadily down the walls when the weather turned. Frontier winter loved such bargains. Warmth for risk, quiet for danger. The roof above all of this was its own suspense. Roofs on the prairie were never simple lids. They were calculations. Too light, and wind lifted at them until every nail seemed personal. Too heavy, and snow load bowed them toward collapse. Wood shingles were good if you had the timber. Thatch existed where grass could be bundled. Sod could be laid atop beams for insulation, which sounds wonderfully practical until you picture the weight of wet earth and winter snow leaning down into your sleep. Some families set stones or even old wagon parts atop roofing to keep things in place when the prairie decided to practice lifting the world. There is a sound, I think, that only people under a frontier roof in a blizzard would fully understand. The deep groan of loaded beams, a slow complaint overhead, then the tap and plink of melt finding its path into a pan placed below a known leak. Children, in some households, were sent up in calmer moments to clear snow from the roof. Imagine that. A small figure with a shovel, almost swallowed by white, standing on the frail top of the family's only real protection. And then there was light. Or rather, the shortage of it. A winter shelter without proper light becomes smaller in a frightening way. The storm outside and the darkness inside begin to join forces. Glass windows were rare and precious. Many cabins used openings covered by greased paper or hides. The paper, brushed with lard or grease until it turned translucent, let in a milky sort of daylight and blocked the worst of the weather. At night, shutters closed, and the house accepted its own little cave-like darkness until a candle or lantern fought it back. A greased paper window has a sadness to it that I cannot quite shake. It gives you light, but not a clear world. You can see movement, brightness, the rough shape of weather, but no detail. A tree is only a blur. In heavy snow, the outside vanishes into a pale wash. Some settlers pasted little drawings or scraps behind such paper. Birds, flowers, letters, tiny bits of color or memory, so that even the window could become a kind of hopeful fiction. Candles and lanterns took over after sunset. Tallow candles smelled of animal fat and smoke. Kerosene lanterns were brighter, but relied on supplies not always easy to spare. Sometimes a family made do with improvised lamps, grease in a cup, a rag for a wick, the flame wavering low as if unsure of its own future. That small light could change the whole room. Faces emerge. The edges of quilts, steam from a kettle, soot on the beams. The family draws closer. Researchers still argue over how much such dim lighting affected mental life in winter cabins. Some think the gloom deepened loneliness and strain. Others note how firelight and lantern light fostered intimacy. Song, prayer, story. Again, both can be true. A weak flame can make despair more visible and family more precious in the same hour. The deeper we go into these shelters, the more the pattern reveals itself. Survival was never one grand invention. It was layering. Barn warmth, snow insulation, roof maintenance, weak light, patched seams. All of it added together until the family had just enough of a margin to rest their heads. Not comfort, margin. And when the night settles fully, with the barn quieting, the cabin banked in snow, the roof carrying its burden, and the greased paper panes glowing faintly before the shutters close, the family lies down in a room held together by improvisation. A horse shifts in the barn outside. Snow whispers against the walls. The lantern lowers to a small, obedient glow. Darkness thickens, but not completely. Somewhere in the room, a child asks whether the storm will still be there in the morning. Someone answers softly that all storms move on eventually. You lie there with them, in the weighted hush after labor, listening to the house breathe through its cracks and patches and crude devices, and you begin to feel the next pressure already coming. Not only cold now, but the long inward grind of winter itself. Hunger, smoke, fear, the sound of wolves outside, the need for songs, stories, chores, and one another if the walls are going to keep more than bodies alive. Winter on the frontier was not only a test of whether walls could stand, it was also a test of whether minds could stay lit while the world outside went white and silent for too long. Once the shelter was raised, patched, and weighted against the storm, a family still had to endure inside it. Days shortened, food thinned, water froze in buckets. The same room held sleeping, cooking, mending, worrying, and waiting. And in that closeness, people either learned how to breathe together or they slowly came apart. Children, more than anyone, reveal the true rhythm of a winter shelter. On the frontier, children's work was not decorative. It was structural, in the same way a latch or a stove was structural. A boy hauled in armfuls of wood, too small for a grown man to bother with, but vital for kindling. A girl carried a bucket of snow inside to melt for water because the creek lay too far or too dangerous in the storm. Another child held the lantern while a parent checked a roof beam. Survival loved every available pair of hands, however small. If you were inside the cabin now in the blue dark before dawn, you would hear the day begin in those little sounds. A bucket set down too hard on the dirt floor, a saw rasping over a log round, a child blowing carefully at embers while an older sister guards a shawl from the sparks, damp mittens steaming by the stove, boots once pulled on, making stiff little creaks as the leather remembers yesterday's thaw and refreezes itself by the door. Childhood on the prairie did not wait to become useful. It was useful at once. There is debate, of course, about what that meant. Some memoirs remember the work with pride, as proof that every child mattered and was trusted. Other accounts, and some modern historians with good reason, see it as the erosion of childhood under pressure. A child can feel proud and burdened in the same hour. A task can teach capability and steal ease at once. I think the truth lives in that overlap. The cabin itself becomes a kind of school. Not a school of books, though sometimes books were present, but a school of repetition. Feed the stove. Carry the wood. Shut the door quickly. Shake the snow from the blanket before it melts on the floor. Listen for the roof when the wind changes. Check the bucket. Check the lamp. The lessons are remembered in the body long before they are named in language. Because rooms were small and winters were long, sound mattered enormously. A harsh room could become gentler through the right noise. This is where stories and music enter not as decoration, but as another survival practice. One of the most moving facts about frontier winters, to me, is how often people answered the storm with voice. Hymns, ballades, tall tale, Bible readings, rhymes for children. Fiddle tunes pulled a little flat by the cold. The weather outside might be beyond human control. The atmosphere inside the room, at least for a little while, was not. Picture it. A lantern smoking softly. The stove ticking as its iron expands and settles. Quilts hung along the walls to cut drafts. A father with a fiddle that has crossed more miles than anyone should reasonably expect from a fiddle. He draws the bow once. Not elegantly, perhaps, but steadily. A note blooms in the room, thin at first, then warmer as the wood wakes to it. A child laughs because one string sounds slightly wrong. A mother, who has been measuring flour and fatigue all afternoon, sits down at last and hums the line she already knows is coming. The storm does not stop, but music lays itself over the noise of the storm like another blanket. Some nights, stories took the place of song. A tale from the road west, a memory of a farm back east. A Bible story read aloud so slowly that even the younger children could drift in and out of it like a prayer. There are accounts of children acting out little dramas during storms, with quilts as costumes, broom handles as rifles or swords, snow personified into a villain, because giving danger a face can make it easier to answer. I can imagine the room now. The youngest child wrapped in a blanket, stomping about as the blizzard, while siblings pretend to fend him off. It is funny. It is sad. It is perfectly frontier. Not every night would have been so charming. Of course, repetition can soothe and wear down at the same time. The same story told for the fifth evening in a row is either comfort or torment, depending on how tired you are. Some historians emphasize the value of these rituals for morale. Others point out how many letters from frontier winters mention boredom, irritability, or the kind of low anger produced by too many people in one room too long. That sounds right to me. Music and storytelling did not erase hardship. They merely gave it fewer empty corners to breathe in. And then there were the neighbors. Frontier mythology loves the image of the solitary family standing alone against the elements. But winter often made solitude impractical. Cabins might be built close, or even share a wall if labor and materials could be combined. Two households could save wood and reduce heat loss by leaning their lives together, literally. In especially harsh periods, people cut doorways between shelters or carved paths through drifted snow so they could pass without fully stepping out into the weather. Survival on the prairie did not always look like rugged independence. Sometimes it looked like listening to someone else's baby cry through a wall and being grateful for the proof that another house was still alive. A shared wall has a powerful emotional texture. You lie under your quilt and hear another family's supper, spoons against their bowls. A cough, a snatch of laughter, the scrape of a chair, a fiddle half muffled by logs. It is intimate and intrusive at once. Privacy thins. Loneliness thins, too. Children can compare stories about the storm through a little inside door while their elders debate the wood supply or swap food. It could also mean quarrels over noise, over borrowed flour, over whose child tracked in the mud. Researchers who study frontier communities often note that these winter arrangements helped lay the groundwork for actual social worlds on the prairie. Shared labor in summer-built cabins. Shared vulnerability in winter built something harder to name and more important to keep. Obligation. Memory. Annoyance. Loyalty. The whole muddy substance of community. One family's stove becoming another family's reassurance. One child's song carrying through logs into a room where a sick man is trying not to think about fever. There were darker sounds, too. Wolves, for instance. Or perhaps, more accurately, the idea of wolves braided into the real sound of them. Settler letters mention wolves often. Their howls carried far over snow, which is one reason the mind could place them anywhere from the edge of the yard to the horizon, whichever seemed worse at the time. Some historians think the danger has been exaggerated in later retellings, that wolves mostly haunted the imagination more than the doorway. Others note livestock losses, dogs taken, packs seen close enough to frighten a whole household awake. I have no trouble believing both. Fear does not require constant attack. Sometimes it only requires a voice in the dark. A frontier cabin at night with wolves somewhere outside becomes a study in thinness. The papered window hums softly in the wind. The rough door latch clunks into place. The rifle leans within reach, not because anyone wishes to use it, but because no one can bear the thought of being without it. The dog by the hearth lifts its head and growls low at a sound no one else heard first. The children go quiet. Then a howl. Long. Wavering. Beautiful in the most unwelcome way. The room draws inward around it. What I find most striking about those moments is that they reveal the emotional center of all this labor. People were not only building against the weather, they were building against exposure itself, against the knowledge that outside was huge and indifferent and populated by hungers that did not understand property lines. A latch was not merely wood. It was an argument with everything beyond it. Winter also had a way of making ordinary deficiencies feel almost metaphysical. Water froze indoors. That fact alone still startles me every time I meet it in a diary. Buckets icing over beside a glowing stove. Frost climbing across a blanket. A wash basin turning to a shallow disk of white during the night. You would wake, reach for water, and touch the fact that the cold had entered the house anyway. However much wood you had burned, however much mud you had packed into the seams, winter had still signed its name inside. The sensory detail of such a morning is almost painfully clear. The room gray with first light. Frost feathers on the greased paper window. Your breath a visible thing before your face. The kettle empty of heat. A child laughing, perhaps, at the sight of his own frozen footprints by the bed, because children have a gift for making sport of what would otherwise break the mood entirely. A father standing over the stove in his shirt, feeding it wood with the sort of reverence city people reserve for altars. Scholars talk about this, too. Whether such conditions were accepted as ordinary by settlers or experienced as ongoing trauma softened in later memory. I suspect it varied by temperament and by how long the winter had already lasted. But I do know that any family who woke day after day to frozen water, smoky air, and the same four walls would have needed more than architecture to survive intact. That is where the small acts of mental protection mattered. A child tracing letters from a newspaper pasted onto the wall as insulation. A mother turning repetitive chores into songs so the day had a rhythm kinder than dread. A father carving a game piece from a scrap of wood because entertainment did not have to be elegant to interrupt despair. One account recalls children learning words from printed flour sacks hung or pasted inside the house. Imagine that. Literacy arriving through insulation. Best flour or some mill stamp becoming part of the room's visual world until a child could sound it out aloud while the storm scratched outside. Even humor played a role. Dry frontier humor. Usually, jokes about smoke doing the seasoning. Jokes about coffee weak enough to read a newspaper through. Jokes about if the wind got any stronger, the house would have to pay rent to remain where it was. The people who survived hardest conditions often sound half amused by disaster after the fact. And then, once you have built the wall, shared it, patched it, heard wolves around it, frozen inside it, sung within it, you begin to see the frontier shelter for what it really was. Not a static object, a living arrangement, a place maintained every day by labor, noise, compromise, and morale. A house was not shelter because it existed. It was shelter because people kept it functioning and kept one another functioning inside it. By nightfall in such a winter room, the tasks slow. A child finally stops moving and sinks into quilts. The lantern lowers. The fiddle is set aside. Next door, through a shared wall, or merely across the yard, another household settles too. The wind keeps going. It always does. But now the cabin contains more than bodies and fire. It contains the day's repaired spirit. The latch is fastened. Somewhere outside, the prairie remains enormous and blank and willing to kill without emotion. Inside, though, there is still a murmur of human life refusing to disappear into the weather. And as you lie listening to that murmur fade into the smaller sounds of sleep, you can feel the next pressure coming inward from the corner where the woodpile shrinks and the shelf of stored food looks barer than it did a week ago. Because winter was never only a war against cold. Soon the deeper enemy arrives, quieter, more patient, and just as deadly if ignored. Hunger. The songs and stories have done their work for a while. They have laid a softer blanket over the room and quieted the sharpest edges of the night. But dawn has a way of restoring the harder truths. Music cannot be split for kindling. A hymn cannot be boiled into stew. A joke, however good, does not fill a wood box or a flour sack. By morning, the family is back where every frontier winter eventually led them, to the two bleak ledgers that ruled the season, the woodpile and the shelf of stored food. You stand in the cabin now with the first weak light pressing through a greased paper pane, and your eyes go immediately to the corner where the fuel has been stacked. It is smaller than it should be, smaller than anyone feels comfortable saying aloud. Each log is not merely wood anymore. It is heat measured out in hours. It is a night not yet lost. It is breakfast with steam instead of frozen breath. One of the hard, plain facts of frontier winter was that a small stove could devour a shocking amount of fuel in bitter weather. Families cut and split through the autumn with aching shoulders, thinking the pile looked high enough. Then January arrived and corrected their optimism. If you were standing beside the father now, you would see how his gaze lingers on the stack before he turns away from it, as though looking too long might make it shrink faster. He picks up one log and weighs it in his hand. Dry bark flakes off under his thumb. The wood smells faintly sweet, like sap trapped in memory. When he feeds it into the stove, the iron answers with a low tick and a rising glow. The room brightens, but only for a moment. Everyone in the cabin notices the same thing. One more log gone. That is the rhythm. Chop, carry, burn, repeat. A frontier winter turns warmth into labor so efficiently that even rest feels borrowed. Men hauled axes out into air, cold enough to slice the throat with every breath. They split wood with mittened hands until the handles slicked with frost and sweat. Children carried in armfuls of kindling, twigs no bigger than wrists, yet treasured as if they were silver. Women stretched flame as carefully as they stretched food, feeding the stove only enough to keep life moving, never enough to allow luxury. Survival on the prairie was rarely dramatic. More often it sounded like a blade striking a log again and again until daylight thinned. And still the storm sometimes outlasted the pile. This is where the frontier becomes oddly intimate with humiliation. Families who had crossed half a continent dreaming of ownership and independence found themselves burning pieces of their own lives. Broken chairs, bed slats, macrate, a wagon part too damaged to trust on the road but good enough to turn briefly into heat. One journal tells of bread baked over the flames of a dismantled bed frame. Rest turned into fire so that tomorrow might still contain rest again. When wood failed, some turned to what the plains offered in abundance, and no one preferred to discuss at supper. Dried buffalo chips, gathered and stacked, then carried to the stove as emergency fuel. The smell was pungent, earthy, a little insulting to the idea of civilized domesticity. But heat has always been better than pride in places like this. Picture a child wrinkling his nose while a mother pretends not to notice the odor and keeps stirring the pot. A family can laugh at such things if they choose. Or they can call it what it is. Another frontier bargain. Warmth at the cost of comfort. Scholars still argue about these shortages. Some insist careful planning could spare most families the worst of them. Others note that blizzards stayed longer than expected. Temperatures plunged lower than memory allowed for, and storms buried piles that had seemed ample in October. Skill mattered. Luck mattered too. Perhaps that is what makes these stories feel so uneasy. The settlers wanted winter to be something they could defeat by effort alone. Winter kept reminding them that effort and chance were sleeping in the same bed. And while the wood shrinks, the food shrinks with it. A frontier cabin in winter is a pantry as much as a shelter. Shelves hold the ghost of summer. Jars of preserves, crocks of butter, sacks of cornmeal, beans, flour, smoked meat if the year has gone kindly. Each item is a memory of warmer labor. Each item is also a countdown. You can feel that countdown in the room now as a mother opens a barrel, then another, then pauses over a sack that no longer has enough weight in it to be reassuring. The smell rises slowly. Salt pork, brine, vinegar, dried apples, old flour, smoke. Nothing extravagant. Everything essential. One of the cruelest features of winter hunger is that it begins before starvation. It begins with watching portions shrink. A ladle held a little lower. Bread sliced thinner. A child told to wait until evening. Bowls scraped too clean. A dog staring with a gaze so patient it hurts to meet it. Frontier letters and recollections are full of this subdued arithmetic. Families did not always say the word hunger. They described the shelf instead. The near empty crock, the half sack, the last jar of something sweet saved until morale broke. If you lift one of those jars in your imagination now, it feels heavier with meaning than with food. Dried apples, leathery and dark, smelling faintly sharp and lovely in a room grown used to salt and smoke. A single raisin given to a child could become a treasure large enough to be remembered for decades. Molasses or honey, if any remained, was spread so thinly on bread it was almost symbolic. Yet a symbol can matter. A sweet taste in the middle of a bitter season tells the body that delight has not been entirely banished from the world. A child calling a blackened ash cake apple pie, and the parents laughing because the alternative would be to count the flour again and speak too honestly. Bread in these winters was less romance than strategy. Cornmeal stirred with water and little else. Johnny cakes, ash cakes, flat rounds browned on iron or directly in embers. Their smell was faintly charred. Their texture coarse, sometimes gritty from pores sifting and ash dust. Yet when a pan hissed and a cake browned, the room felt briefly richer. Some historians describe these humble breads as the true center of winter survival. Not because they nourished magnificently, but because they could be made repeatedly, predictably, and cheaply. Others point out that a belly lined with cornmeal is not the same thing as a body well nourished. Both are right. A family could survive on such food and still weaken. They could be full for an hour and underfed for a month. The frontier had many ways of keeping people alive, just above the line where real collapse began. There are the darker improvisations, the stories people later told with a kind of embarrassed pride. Flour stretched with ground husks. Acorns turned into bitter meal. Snow pancakes made with melted drifts and whatever remained in the flour crock. Leather boiled soft enough to chew when nothing else could be had. Such accounts may be exaggerated at times. Yet even if memory sharpened the drama, the fact that these stories survived at all tells its own truth. At the table, hunger changes the quality of silence. The spoon against a tin bowl sounds louder than it should. The swallow after weak broth feels deliberate. A child asks for more in a voice that knows the answer already. The mother promises breakfast will be better, though she has no basis for the promise beyond love. The father stares not at the child, but at the door. This is where winter hunting enters, not as sport, but as an argument with emptiness. A rifle is lifted from its place by the wall. A hat comes down over the brow. The door opens, and the cold cuts in immediately, clean and merciless. Hunting in frontier blizzards was as dangerous as it sounds, and more necessary than anyone wished it to be. Deer, rabbits, grouse, prairie chickens, whatever might still be found. Tracks in snow could lead to supper or to hours of wandering that burned more strength than they returned. Yet families went because the pot had to hold something besides hope. Picture the hunter stepping into the white. Snow squeaks dry underfoot. Breath burns. The world narrows to prints. Brush, distant movement, the metallic bite of a gun barrel against the hand. Dogs bark somewhere behind, their voices swallowed quickly by the drifts. The trees, where there are trees, smell faintly of pine and animal musk. The air itself feels thin with waiting. Hunting in such weather must have made every sound enormous. A branch crack, a quick wing beat, the sudden shock of a rabbit springing from cover. Your own heartbeat loud enough to seem like a mistake. Some diaries mention deadfall traps set close to the cabin. Practical little ambushes baited with scraps because venturing far into a storm was not always possible. Imagine waking in the pale, early light to hear a trap spring outside, and knowing, before your eyes even open fully, that breakfast may be waiting in the snow. One child remembered precisely that. The relief must have felt immediate and almost guilty. Life taken, yes, but also the crack in the wall of hunger. A rifle cracks through the trees. Then stillness. Either you carry something back over your shoulder and the whole cabin changes its mood before you even step inside, or you return empty and the silence around the stove grows heavier than before. That difference, the smell of rich broth or the return of thin gruel, shaped family memory more than any grand frontier speech ever could. There is an anecdote that lingers with me about a grouse lifted almost out of the snow where it had buried itself for warmth, feathers drifting through the cabin while children plucked it. Such a small thing in one sense. Yet, imagine the smell when it hit the stew pot. Meat and fat rising through a room accustomed to beans and smoke. Luxury does not always look like abundance. Sometimes it looks like animal grease shining on the surface of broth. Neighbors complicated this further. One family fortunate in the hunt might share. Another might not. A knock on the door with hunger behind it could turn kindness into a painful calculation. Some people divided what they had because winter demanded community. Others held tighter because children in their own beds were already too thin. It is easy to judge such choices from a warm room in another century. Harder to judge them when a pot is barely enough for the mouths already inside the house. The frontier also widened the menu in ways people later preferred not to dwell on. Porcupine, crow, skunk. In some cases, whatever could be trapped, shot, cleaned, boiled, and swallowed. Taste became secondary. Warmth in the belly mattered more. Calorie by calorie. Improvised meal by improvised meal. Winter was endured. The room settles again at the end of this long day. The woodpile is lower. The flour sack lighter. Perhaps a rabbit hangs by the door for tomorrow. Or perhaps only hope does. The stove gives out its steady pulse. The pot cools on the iron top. Children sleep with crumbs on their lips or dream of spring fields while their stomachs negotiate with the dark. You sit with the family in the hush after labor, and you can feel how survival on the prairie was never a straight line towards safety. And now, with the body fed only just enough, and the fire banked low, another danger edges closer. Not the wind, this time. Not even hunger. A cough in the corner. A hot forehead in a cold room. The harsh truth that once blizzards sealed a family inside, sickness could spread as quietly and as completely as the snow outside the walls. Illness in a frontier cabin had a different kind of silence from hunger. Hunger sat openly at the table. It stared from the shelf and measured itself in jars and loaves and the depth of the bean sack. Sickness moved more softly. A cough. A flushed cheek. A child who did not laugh at supper. A mother pausing with her hand against a forehead a little longer than usual. Then the whole room shifted around that one body, because once the storm had shut the door, there would be no doctor riding in quickly through the drifts, and no apothecary shelf waiting in town. Whatever healing the family possessed had already crossed the prairie with them in a few small bottles. Some herbs, some lore, and an unreasonable amount of faith. One of the harder truths of winter shelter is that warmth and closeness, the very things that kept people alive, also helped sickness travel. Smoke thickened the air. Dampness clung to quilts. Too many lungs worked in too little space. A fever inside a prairie cabin was never an isolated event. It changed the breathing of everyone in the room. You can feel that change now. The stove hisses softly. The kettle murmurs. But underneath there is a cough that keeps returning, rough and deep enough to make every adult glance up. If you were standing beside the bed now, the child beneath the blanket would look almost unreal against the rest of the room. Outside, frost whitens the window covering. Inside, that small face glows with heat. The contrast is startling every time. A world cold enough to freeze the water in a bucket. And here, one little forehead burning under your palm. The skin is damp. The breath too quick. The eyes half open and unfocused. Medicine, in the formal sense, was scarce and unreliable. Families might carry patent tonics or little tins of salve, but once the weather closed in, they depended mostly on remedies that belonged as much to tradition as to chemistry. Vinegar cloths laid cool across a fevered brow. Pine needle tea, bitter and sharp. For coughs or weakness, onions heated and laid against the chest. Goose grease rubbed into skin. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth and tucked against cold feet or aching sides. Melted snow stirred with molasses when there was molasses to spare. We cannot be sure how much these treatments truly healed. Some scholars argue that pine needle infusions did offer real value. Enough vitamin C to matter, enough warmth to soothe. Others think many remedies were more comfort than cure. Yet comfort is not a small thing when the alternative is helplessness. The cabin smells different once sickness enters. Smoke is still there, yes, and wool and old wood. But now vinegar cuts through it, sharp and clean at first, then almost sour as the cloth cools. Onions warming by the stove release their pungent sweetness. Animal fat used in poultices lends the room a faint, greasy note that clings to quilts and sleeves. A kettle left steaming all afternoon adds humidity to the air until every breath feels thick. In another sort of house, that atmosphere might be intolerable. Here it is the smell of trying. One letter tells of hot bricks wrapped and changed through the night at a child's feet. Another of syrup made from what little sweetness remained in the cabin because a sore throat needed gentleness more than the pantry could spare it. I imagine those long hours by the stove, one adult half asleep in a chair, cloth cooling in a bowl, fire dropping low, then stirred again, then dropping. The room must have narrowed to essentials: heat, water, breath, prayer. And the fear was not abstract. A cough could sink deeper. A fever could hold for days. A cut on a finger, insignificant in summer, could fester when cleanliness was poor and bodies were already run down. Frostbite could claim toes or fingertips with a casual cruelty that frontier diaries sometimes report with alarming calm. There are moments in old accounts where the emotional tone almost vanishes because people had no energy left for ornament. A child worsened. A man lost feeling in his foot. A woman coughed blood. Those plain statements carry more chill than pages of dramatic language ever could. Still, families did what they could beyond salves and teas. They changed the story inside the room. A sick child was told tales of green grass and birds returning. A hymn hummed very low, a favorite spoon pressed into a hand for broth. Story itself became medicine of a sort. One mother recalled that her boy grew calmer when she spoke of spring fields, as though the mind offered a road out of winter, helped the body follow it. Researchers disagree, as they do about so much in frontier history, on how much to admire these domestic cures. Some call them ingenuity and resilience, proof that people found help wherever they could. Others see in them the stark evidence of neglect, families pushed into environments where ordinary medical care was too distant to matter. Both readings feel true to me. A pine tea can be both useful and tragic. Useful because it warms and may help. Tragic because it is all there is. Night deepens around a sickbed in peculiar ways. The storm outside may go on, but it feels farther away than the small sounds inside. A spoon against a cup, a cough, a mother humming under her breath, water beginning to simmer again, wax softening and running down a candle. The room is full of tiny efforts, none of them grand, all of them essential. If you listen closely enough, you can hear how much love sounds like labor. And then there are the mornings when the fever eases. Every frontier family seems to have known the unbelievable relief of a forehead finally cooling. The child sleeping deeper. The breathing less harsh. The room somehow expanding again as worry loosens its grip on the ribs. A kettle of tea tastes different then. The sunrise through the papered window looks less cruel. Even the stove seems to burn more kindly. But illness did not always leave so neatly, and frontier fear developed another shape around that. Not only the fear of a body failing, but the fear of the house itself becoming a kind of tomb in the snow. By the deepest part of a long storm, a cabin could change from refuge into something almost entombed. Drifts climbed the walls. The world beyond the window whitened until there was no horizon at all. Sound outside grew muffled. Sometimes the door had to be forced open against packed snow. Sometimes it would not open until dug free. In such moments, settlers began speaking of their homes the way animals might speak of dens if animals had diaries. Burrows. Caves. Places to wait out the burying weight above. One family, according to an old recollection, played what they called burial games with their children to soften the fear. They pretended they were bears sleeping safe beneath winter, or rabbits tucked into warm earth. I find that at once charming and devastating. Imagine teaching a child to think of near burial as comfort because the alternative description is too terrible to say aloud. Yet children laughed. They wriggled under quilts and called themselves hibernating creatures. Innocence can be a kind of genius. The silence in a snow-sealed house is unlike any other silence. No wind shrieking through the usual cracks. No distant howl. Only the subdued inner noises of living. A stove popping. Someone turning under blankets. The occasional sift of snow or dirt from overhead. At first, that hush can feel merciful. Then it can begin to feel oppressive, as though the world has forgotten the house entirely. You lie there listening for the roof, for the walls, for any sign that the pressure outside has become too much. Every small creak overhead sounds like a verdict waiting to decide itself. A father lies awake longer than he admits. A mother measures the air without meaning to, noticing how many bodies breathe in one room. Smoke from the stove clears too slowly because the outside world has pressed so close around the house. A child asks in the dark whether morning can still find them. The answer, spoken softly, must carry more confidence than the speaker actually has. Some historians present such episodes as evidence of extraordinary adaptability. Others emphasize how narrow the margin really was. One heavy drift too many. One roof beam gone soft. One chimney blocked. One door frozen shut. The frontier often survived, not because its shelters were perfect, but because disaster arrived 1 inch short of finality. That is not a romantic thought. Exactly. But it may be the truest one. Still, dawn did come. It mattered every time. Pale blue light through a seam. A father shouldering at the door until it gives just enough. A rush of outside air, sharp enough to hurt and sweet enough to make children laugh. Smoke clearing. The room exhaling. Snowbanks towering almost to the roofline, making the little cabin look less built than excavated. You step back in your mind and see it now, half buried, smoke trailing weakly upward, life inside, still stubbornly alight. And then, after enough such mornings, the season begins to change. It never arrives all at once. Winter does not surrender with grace. It loosens one finger at a time. The first true sunlight after weeks of storm can feel almost indecent in its intensity, as though the room is being searched. Dust in the air turns golden. The papered window glows. Someone laughs for no reason except brightness itself. Outside, the sound changes too. No longer the muffled pressure of drifted snow alone, but dripping, icicles tapping down from the eaves. Water trickling where before there had only been freeze. The earth beneath the crust beginning, very cautiously, to breathe. The smell changes with it. Wet soil, raw thaw. Something alive under all that long white silence. Children notice first, or at least respond first. One letter mentions children running outside on the first real thaw and splashing barefoot in cold puddles until their mother dragged them back in. Furious and relieved and unable to suppress a smile for long. I can picture it clearly. Mud on little ankles. Laughter bouncing against the side of a cabin that only days before felt like a sealed ark. Joy looks especially bright after a hard winter. Perhaps because it has been rationed too. Some settlers mark the first clear day with tiny celebrations. The last bit of flour used for pancakes. A saved sweet finally opened. An extra verse of a hymn sung with more force than accuracy. One family, according to a diary, called their first thaw breakfast victory cakes. Burnt and bland, perhaps, but tasting of triumph because they had not starved, not frozen, not coughed themselves into silence. They had lasted. Of course, the danger was not over. Thaw brought mud, collops risk, spoiled stores, sickness that had not quite left, and the long work of seeing what winter had damaged. Scholars debate whether the first break in the weather truly marked safety or only a different phase of difficulty. But for families inside those shelters, I suspect the emotional meaning mattered just as much as the practical one. The first light did not solve everything. It proved that ending was possible. The shelter that once seemed crude now looks miraculous. Not because it was beautiful, because it held. Through wood and bread, through smoke and song, through fever and hunger, through wolves and burial silence and the long arithmetic of fuel, it held. That, in the end, may be the quietest and deepest truth of frontier winter. These shelters were not triumphs of architecture. They were acts of patience. Rough boxes, earth walls, half-buried rooms, patched roofs, animal warmth, greased paper, hot bricks, bitter tea, and one more night survived. They asked very little of beauty and everything of endurance. And now, as the horizon clears and the room brightens, the family inside begins to understand that the storm has not won. Not this time. The house no longer feels only like a bunker. It begins, tentatively, to feel like a home that might outlast the season. There is still much to mend, much to dig out, much to count and fear and rebuild. But the light is stronger. The drips are real. The prairie has softened its voice. And somewhere just under the wet smell of thaw, spring has begun to whisper back. By the time the thaw begins to whisper at the edges of the prairie, the shelters these families built have become more than walls. They are records. Each crack in the chinking, each smoke stain above the stove, each sag in the roof, each rag pressed into a draft, each muddy footprint hardened near the door tells its own quiet history of what was endured there. Winter has passed through the house like a difficult guest, touching everything. And now, in the gray softening light of late season, the family begins the strange work of taking stock. If you were standing with me outside the cabin now, the first thing you would notice is not beauty, but damage. Snow has pulled away from the walls in dirty ridges. The roof looks tired. The chimney leans with a fatigue that seems almost human. The door, which all winter felt like a brave defender, now shows swollen edges and a hinge that complains every time it moves. Along the lower logs, the mud chinking has cracked in long, narrow lines, dried after so much freezing and thawing, leaving the wall looking stitched and scarred. Nothing has collapsed. That matters. Yet nothing has escaped untouched. Honestly, I think this is one of the most revealing moments in frontier history. Not the storm itself, not the first desperate building, but the morning after a season of survival, when a family finally has enough daylight and enough strength to look closely at what saved them. A shelter in winter is judged by whether it holds through the night. A shelter in spring is judged by what it costs to make it hold. The repairs begin almost at once. They have to. A cabin that survived one winter poorly cannot be trusted to meet the next without argument. So the same hands that once raised logs and packed sod return to the walls in a different mood now. Less panic. More worn resolve. A father stands with a bucket of fresh clay and straw. A mother sorts old cloth, deciding what can still be spared for stuffing cracks. Children scrape loose, chinking from seams with little sticks and collected in pans. There is a rhythm to maintenance, and it sounds less dramatic than building, but in some ways it is more intimate. Construction declares. Repair remembers. Touch one of those walls now in your imagination. The surface feels rough and dry where winter once pressed wet snow against it for days. Mud flakes under your fingers. A strand of moss peeks from a crack like a little green survival of its own. The smell is different from the smell of autumn building. Less fresh wood now. More old smoke, dust, and thawing earth. The house carries winter in its skin. A sod wall changes too when spring comes. It darkens in places where meltwater has soaked through. It softens at the edges. Tiny roots, which all winter seemed frozen into obedience, begin to wake and fray. Families who lived in sod houses faced a second season of labor once the snows withdrew. Leaks had to be found. Sagging places had to be shored up. Roofs had to be judged with an honest eye. Did that heavy cap of earth insulate nobly, or had it spent the winter plotting collapse? Scholars still debate which form of shelter truly aged best under plains conditions. Log or sot, timber or earth. I suspect every answer changed with each family, each storm, each patch of luck. There is humor here. 2. Because frontier people had a practical gift for laughing at the homes that had nearly buried them. One family might joke that the roof had finally decided to settle where it belonged. Another, that the cow knew the barn better than the people knew the house. I can imagine a mother sweeping yet another shower of soil from the floor and saying, with perfect dryness, that the prairie had been generous enough to move in permanently. That kind of humor matters. It turns damage into narrative and keeps shame from hardening. And there could be shame. Some settlers must have looked around at spring and seen not a proud homestead but a patchwork of compromise. A dugout still damp, a papered window half torn, a roof weighted with old wagon boards and wishes. Letters sent east did not always describe the full ugliness. Yet even when people minimized it, the shelters themselves told the truth. These were not elegant frontier dreams. They were hard-won containers of continued breathing. Inside, the winter marks remain just as clearly. Soot has darkened the rafters. Smoke has settled into quilts and coats and hair and wooden spoons until everything smells faintly of stove life. The floor round the hearth is worn smooth by boots and spilled water and ash. A child can stand beneath the papered window and point to the exact place where frost crept across the inside on the coldest mornings. Another can show the crack where a draft used to find his ankles before it was packed tight with a page from an old newspaper. Houses become memory palaces in that way, every flaw tied to a story. This is also the season when people could finally compare methods. Through long winter evenings, they might have defended their choices fiercely. Log cabins are proper houses. Sod houses are warmer. Dugouts are desperate. Barn sleeping is for emergencies. Snow-packed walls are clever. Snow-packed walls are a trap. But once the season loosens, neighbors begin to see who came through best, whose roof held, whose walls stayed warmest, whose stove drew cleanly, whose stores ran shortest, whose windows admitted light without too much cold. Frontier knowledge did not remain theoretical for long. It was always tested publicly by weather. If you walk the little settlement now in your mind, you can almost read these lessons from one doorway to the next. Here a cabin whose chinking failed and had to be redone 3 times. There a sod house low and ungainly but still surprisingly steady. Over there a barn that served half as a house for weeks and now smells like both supper and livestock in equal measure. Beyond it, a dugout entrance nearly slumped by melt, with a father already setting new supports because he cannot bear the thought of rebuilding the whole thing from scratch. Each shelter stands like a thesis, defended before winter, and only now graded. And then there are the emotional repairs, quieter, but just as real. A child who no longer wakes at every gust. A mother who unpacks a few saved things because perhaps they will not freeze tonight. A father who dares to stop counting the wood every time he passes the stack. Songs return to the room without quite so much strain in them. Laughter lasts longer. Someone scrubs the table not because guests are coming, but because ordinary order is returning. And ordinary order is one of the sweetest luxuries after fear. I have always found it strange that so much of frontier endurance is remembered in bold images. Wagons, rifeless, storms, wolves. Yet the true victory may have looked like a woman opening a shutter to let in light without flinching at the cold, or a child laying aside one extra quilt because the afternoon has grown warm enough to trust for an hour. Those tiny moments announce the end of siege more clearly than any speech. There is still danger in thaw. Of course, mud can make a yard as treacherous as ice. Stored food can spoil. Roofs can leak harder once melt begins in earnest. Water can pool where frozen certainty once held the ground stiff. A house that survived burial under snow may now find itself taking in rain through every tired seam. Winter never leaves without one last little insult. Yet even those problems carry a different emotional color. They belong to motion again, to season, to time resuming its ordinary march. The prairie itself changes slowly enough that you might miss it if you looked too quickly. At first there is only dripping. Then patches of dark earth appear where snow has thinned. The wind still cuts, but it no longer owns the whole day. Somewhere, a bird tries out a small, uncertain note. The sound is so slight it can make your throat tighten if you have heard only stove noise and storm for too long. Water runs in ruts near the house. Children poke at it with sticks. Dogs splash through it and regret it at once. One of the odd beauties of these settlements is that the shelters looked least impressive at exactly the moment they had proved most valuable. In high winter, a cabin half buried in snow could seem almost magical, a glowing box holding life against impossible odds. In spring, it becomes smaller, more dia, more patched, more visibly crude. The miracle recedes, and the workmanship remains. Perhaps that is why later memory often softened or romanticized such places. The truth was rougher, more smoke-stained, more damp, more comical in its awkwardness, yet no less worthy of respect. Some historians argue that these improvised shelters demonstrate remarkable adaptation to local conditions, and I think that is obviously true. Others argue just as strongly that they reveal how unprepared many settlers were, how quickly promise outpaced infrastructure, how often families were left to improvise because systems meant to support them did not. That is true, too. A sod house can be ingenious and inadequate at once. A log cabin can be cultural determination and stubborn misfit. A barn can be a rescue and an embarrassment. Frontier history often resists the clean compliment. Inside the room now, the family begins to make space for warmer weather. Blankets are shaken out. Bedding dragged into weak sunlight. The paper window is patched again, but this time with more patience. A corner shelf is cleaned. A spoon long thought lost turns up behind a crock. Small recoveries like that can feel absurdly important. The house is not only surviving, it is becoming livable again. Listen to the room for a moment. No howl at the walls. No frantic feeding of the stove. Only the soft brush of a broom over boards or dirt. The clink of jars being moved. A child humming to no one in particular. The door opening and closing without a drift shoving back against it. A horse outside stamping in mud instead of crusted snow. These sounds are the frontier version of peace. And yet, as evening falls, the family still draws close to the fire out of habit. Winter leaves its caution in the body. A mother reaches to check a latch that does not need checking. A father glances at the roof, though no storm is gathering. A child asks if there will be another blizzard. Not frightened exactly, only practical now. This, too, is part of shelter. It teaches not only how to live through a season, but how to remember it in posture and in instinct. By the time the sky turns gold for one brief, clear evening, the cabin stands there under the softening prairie light as both evidence and witness. Rough logs, repacked seams, muddy threshold, smoke or no smoke, it does not matter. It has done the one thing every frontier shelter needed to do. It carried human life through a season that had no interest in carrying it. And as the family settles in, less afraid than they were and more tired than any neat history usually admits, you can feel the story beginning to draw inward toward its last. Quiet understanding. Not about architecture alone, about what people become when the only way forward is to patch, endure, laugh a little, sing when possible, and wait for the land to soften again. In the end, the prairie does not hand out victories in the way people like victories to look. No banner rises over a surviving cabin. No polished monument marks the place where a sod wall held through a blizzard, or where a family in a barn stayed warm on the strength of animal breath and stubbornness. The reward, if there is one, arrives more quietly than that. It arrives as another morning, another small fire, another child waking hungry and alive, another season reached. Frontier survival was not heroic in the theatrical sense most of the time. Kidder, it was repetitive, smoky, muddy, half-improvised, and often uncomfortable enough to make later nostalgia feel a little dishonest. Yet what those families built against winter, whether of logs, soot, earth, snow, hide, cloth, or borrowed warmth, mattered because it worked often enough to carry them beyond the edge of what should have been possible. If you stand now at a little distance from the settlement in your imagination, the whole scene changes shape. Winter is no longer the only force in the picture. The prairie begins to show itself again. Not all at once. It never does anything all at once, except perhaps frighten people. But little by little, brown grass lifting through melt, wheel ruts returning from under the drift, mud glistening where only white had stretched for weeks, smoke from cabins rising more lazily because the air has gentled. The houses themselves look smaller than they did during the storms, less mythical, more handmade. Their flaws become visible again. Yet there is affection in those flaws now. A log cabin with walls that lean almost imperceptibly. A sod house with one corner patched darker than the rest. A dugout mouth reinforced a second time after too much seepage. A barn door that still hangs crooked because no one has had the energy to improve it. These are not failures. They are records of decision. Every crude improvement tells you what kind of winter passed through there and what sort of people stayed. The source of the story has always been the same dark question. How did frontier families build shelter enough to survive deadly blizzards? And the answer, after all this time spent with them, is both simple and uncomfortably broad. They built with whatever the land allowed and whatever their hands could manage before the storm reached them. When wood was near, they cut timber and raised cabins. When wood failed, they cut the prairie into bricks and stacked sod. When time failed, they went into the earth. When walls were not enough, they slept beside animals. When wind found the seams, they stuffed them with moss, clay, rugs, papier, prayer, and sheer repetition. When snow tried to bury them, they let it insulate where it could and dug it back when they had to. When roofs sagged, they propped them. When light was poor, they sung. When food thinned, they stretched it. When sickness entered, they tended it with whatever lay within reach. They survived by layering one insufficient defense upon another until insufficiency itself began to resemble safety. I have always found that the most honest frontier word is enough. Not abundance, not mastery. Enough wood, enough food, enough shelter, enough luck, enough sunrise. A house did not need to be ideal. It had to be enough to get a family to spring. A stew did not need to satisfy. It had to be enough to quiet the belly until tomorrow. A song did not need to be beautiful. It had to be enough to keep fear from filling the whole room. That modesty of purpose gives the history its strange dignity. And there was dignity, even in the miserable parts, especially there, perhaps, in a woman scraping ice from a basin and then turning to mend a seam in the wall without ceremony, in a father counting the last good logs and still cutting one for the stove because the children were shivering, in neighbors passing through a snow tunnel with a loaf or a fiddle or a bit of news, in children working because there was no choice, yet laughing anyway when a chicken stole a crust, or when a little drift by the door became, for 10 minutes, a palace. Dignity does not always look grand. Sometimes it looks like continuing without much applause. There are still historians who resist romantic language around the frontier, and I think they are right to do so. Too many families were underprepared. Too many suffered because land hunger, government policy, and bright promises outran reality. Too many shelters were improvised because there had been no other option left in time. To call all this noble without saying costly would be unfair. Some shelters prolonged hardship more than they solved it. Some winters broke people. Some children remembered more fear than warmth. We cannot pretend otherwise. But it would also be unfair to refuse admiration where admiration is due, because adaptation on the plains was real. A sod house was not a failure of imagination. It was imagination under pressure. A greased paper window was not a joke. It was a deliberate answer to distance and scarcity. A quilt hung over a drafty wall was not decoration. It was engineering in cloth. A barn full of breathing animals was not merely a fallback. It was a thermal system understood in the body before it was ever described in technical language. The frontier was often harsh, precisely because people were learning so quickly with so little margin. Perhaps that is why these shelters linger so strongly in the modern mind. A house today often arrives complete, sealed, measured, finished, insulated by experts and supplied by networks the people inside never see. On the prairie, every family saw the whole chain. The cut wood, The stacked sod, the dripping roof, the ash in the stove, the cracked seam, the patched quilt. Shelter was not hidden infrastructure. It was visible labor all around you. You knew exactly how thin the wall was because you had pressed the mud into it yourself. There is a tenderness in that knowledge. Even if it came wrapped in hardship, a child could point to a certain place on the wall and say that his sister stuffed the rags there during the biggest storm. A mother could remember which quilt square came from an old Sunday dress. A father could run his hand over a beam and know whose shoulder had helped raise it. Modern comfort often erases memory from materials. Frontier shelter gathered memory into every material it could. And then there is the weather itself, which remains, in the end, the largest character in the story. The blizzard does not hate. It does not negotiate. It moves over the plains with the same enormous indifference, whether a child is sleeping inside a wagon or a family has nearly finished a roof. That indifference is what makes the settlers' response so moving. They were not loved by the weather. They were not meant to win its favor. They simply found ways to stay alive in its presence. When night comes again over the prairie in this final mood, it is not the same night from the beginning. The air still cools. The horizon still widens into something almost frightening in its openness. But the room behind the door has changed because the people inside it have changed. They know now what the walls can bear. They know where the drafts hide. They know which child wakes first at the sound of wolves and which one sleeps through everything. They know how much flour one sack truly holds when winter is long. They know what part of the roof sags first under wet snow. They know their own house in the language of survival. And I think that is what transforms a shelter into a home. Not comfort alone, but familiarity earned through danger. A cabin at the start of winter is hope. A cabin at the end of winter is knowledge. A sod house at first is compromise. Later, it becomes biography. Even a dugout, dark and damp, and a little shameful perhaps, in memory, becomes part of the family story. We lived there. We heard the storm above us. We woke to dirt on the blankets and still reach spring. That kind of sentence changes the people who can say it. There is one more image I keep returning to. A child at the end of winter, stepping outside barefoot for one forbidden moment into the first patch of soft mud, laughing because the ground feels alive again. Behind the child, the cabin door hungs open. Inside, the room is still smoky, still rough, still poor by any refined standard. Outside, the wind still carries some chill, yet in that instant the whole season reveals its final lesson. The shelter did not have to conquer the prairie. It only had to outlast the worst of it. So when we ask how frontier families survived deadly blizzards, the answer is not by building perfect houses. They survived by refusing the luxury of perfection. They made rough walls into enough wall. They made dim light into enough light. They made poor food into enough food. They made shared breath, shared labor, shared stories, shared fear, and shared patience into enough life. Over and over again, storm after storm, until the season changed. That may be the softest truth hidden inside this cold history. Human beings do not always endure by becoming harder than the world around them. Sometimes they endure by becoming more flexible, more communal, more inventive, and more willing to accept forms of shelter that pride alone would once have rejected. A barn, a sod wall, a paper window, a quilt hung over a crack, a snowbank packed against a house. These things are humble. That is exactly why they matter. The fire is lower now. The room is quieter. Outside, the prairie breathes in the dark, less hostile than before, though never entirely tame. The shelters stand where they stood, patched, worn, and plain. If you listen closely enough, you can almost hear all the winters they held. The footsteps, the coughing, the fiddle notes, the scrape of shovels, the whisper of straw, the rattle of a latch in a hard wind. None of it grand, all of it enough. And perhaps that is the right place to leave the family tonight. Not in triumph, exactly. Not in comfort, exactly. But in the calm after endurance. A house still standing. A quilt still warm. A stove gone low, but not dead. The land beyond the door vast as ever, and yet no longer quite so frightening as it was when we first stepped onto it at dusk. The blizzards came. The walls held often enough. The people inside changed, suffered, laughed, repaired, and remained. In the history of the prairie, that small persistence is its own kind of miracle. Before the room goes dark completely, let yourself look once more at the ordinary things that made that miracle possible. The bucket by the stove, the spoon worn thin at its edge, the patched sleeve of a child asleep on a quilt, the little shelf where a jar once stood full and now stands empty, not as a failure, but as evidence that its contents did their work, the door bar laid down for the night, the window paper glowing faintly with the last bit of firelight, the roof overhead, perhaps ugly, perhaps uneven, but still there. Frontier history can seem very large from a distance. Migration, land policies, weather, settlement, but it always narrows in the end to these humble domestic objects and the tired hands that kept using them. A blizzard could be vast enough to erase the horizon. Survival still happened spoon by spoon, stitch by stitch, lok by lok. And if there is any lingering sadness in the story, I think it belongs there too. Many of these shelters disappeared. Sod walls melted back into the land. Dugouts caved in. Cabins rotted or were abandoned when families moved on or failed to move on. The prairie keeps very few monuments unless someone insists on one. Yet the memory remains because the act itself mattered. To make a shelter where there should have been none. To hold life together inside it. To wake in the morning and begin again. That is not only frontier history. It is one of the oldest human arts. Good night.